In earlier lectures, I did one yesterday about Antarctic ice. And I spent basically 40 years in the United States Antarctic program. I was editor of the journal that the National Science Foundation published called Antarctic Journal of the United States. And I sent people to the field to work with scientists who were not scientists, such as painters, photographers, writers, poets, even a musician or two, and teachers, in order to bring back the story of science to both the science community and beyond the science community. This is my second lecture talking about some of the recent science achievements in the Antarctic. The National Science Board, which is the governing body of the National Science Foundation, which is a federal agency of the U.S. government, says that we're in the golden age of science. And the Antarctic in particular has been a full participant in this golden age in the ways that you're seeing here, the ability to collect information, store it, and display it. It's just amazing how much is being done in even the last 10 years. The science being done in the Antarctic covers all of the disciplines you might imagine, from geology and geophysics, and glaciology, of course, biology, meteorology, and even astrophysics. I am not going to talk about all those things. I can't in this brief amount of time. Instead, I'm going to select a few recent examples, as I said, that seem to make a lot of sense to tell to people who are just getting a brief glimpse. And the first one I touched on very briefly during the ice lecture is about the changing ice in the Antarctic. And here you are looking at an image. It looks like somebody could have made it with a pencil, but this is an image that takes advantage of millions and millions of data points to display the freshwater ice, the land ice of Antarctica that originated as snow falling from the sky. And so beyond this would be sea ice, and what you're seeing is this land ice is like a big pancake, always accumulating in the middle and sliding off to the edge. And there are some special areas I want to point out. Here is what's an ice shelf, which is ice that has slid off the continent itself and is now floating on the ocean. That's the definition of an ice shelf. This is called the Ross Ice Shelf, which is as big as France. This whole continent is as big as the United States and Mexico put together. Here's another large ice shelf here, another one here, and so forth. But the section of the Antarctic that I want to cover in this, what I think was a very important discovery in 2014, has to do with this area. Now, if you look at these black lines, these are ice divides. So ice on this side of the line is sliding this way, ice on this side of the line is sliding that way, and you see a number of ice divides in the Antarctic. One that is receiving a great deal of attention in the last few years is over here in this region, and it is called the Amundsen Sea Abatement, and Pine Island Glacier is a principal glacier that comes out onto the sea, forms an ice shelf, just like this one but smaller. And a good bit of study has been going on there. This is my first topic to talk to you about today. Here it is just from the air. So here is the floating part of Pine Island Glacier, the ice shelf, floating on the ocean. There you can see some open water. And this is sea ice. And the sea ice has pressure ridges in it. The wind has pushed so hard that it's basically buckled up on itself as if it were building a temporary mountain range. Back in 2 years ago, Pine Island Glacier did what glaciers do all the time. Part of it broke off as an iceberg. This one is a bit bigger than a lot of icebergs, but not the biggest by any means. And this as far as my story is concerned, is just the tip of the iceberg. This is a depiction of ice loss from the land ice of Antarctica in this whole Amundsen Sea embayment here. And there was a paper that was published in November of 2014, just a couple of months ago, Mass Loss of the Amundsen Sea Embayment of West Antarctica from 4 Independent Techniques. And what this paper did was to look at science over the last few years, and it found that 4 different approaches to measuring the ice sheet had come up with some pretty dramatic information. I'm going to tell you the methods before I tell you the information. One was laser and radar altimetry from airplanes and satellites. Another one was changes in gravity. If there's more ice, there's more gravity. If less gravity. Changes in gravity from a pair of satellites happen to be called GRACE. One was ice velocity from imaging radars, and then one was from ice thickness from radar sounders. The 4 methods agreed. And one of the things they agreed on is that the rate of loss, or the scientists use the term acceleration, in the years 2003 to 2009 was 1/3 of the amount of what happened from 1992, from then until 2013. So, this is Guy's candidate for Antarctic Science Discovery of the Year of 2014, and it really is a culmination of an idea that was first advanced around the 1970s. The idea that the West Antarctic Glacial Retreat is unstoppable. And the quote from a scientist is, "We finally have enough observations to put this together." And their main findings, and this, you probably read the headlines on this, 4 feet of ocean rise over the next 1 to 2 centuries, just from the 6 glaciers that were studied. But that will trigger loss from other glaciers, and so you're going to see probably 12 feet over the next century or 2. That's their phrase, century or 2. So when you do the arithmetic, if it's 2 centuries, give them a break. If it's 2 centuries, that's in 2 centuries, who cares? Like, we'll all be gone by then, you know. But when you start to think about it, 1 foot every 17 years, that's less than a mortgage. Or 3/4 of an inch a year, and that compares to about a 1/16 of an inch a year that's going on right now. So clearly, we are seeing some changes in the Antarctic that Antarctic scientists have brought to us, and they are fairly robust findings that have obvious global consequences. And this sort of underscores what I was saying. We're getting most of the science done in the Antarctic just in the last few years. And here's 92% of the scientific titles have been published just since the International Geophysical Year about 55 years ago. And then if you go back another 356 years, only 9%. So it's just a way of signaling this Antarctica is the last continent. Now, the National Science Foundation, the federal agency I talked about, the one I worked for, did what it called a sensational 60 list of research achievements that it had funded over the years of its existence. And if you do the arithmetic on the size of the Antarctic budget within the National Science Foundation, we should have gotten about 2 out of the 60 achievements. But instead we got 5. And there's the list of them. Dave mentioned a bit about the antifreeze proteins in fish, extremophiles, that is to say, life forms in extreme areas of the world. Global climate change, of course, is a continuing subject of study that has particular need for Antarctica. International cooperation in the ozone hole, and as I mentioned, I'm going to give an entire lecture about the ozone hole. That just give you a sense of how Antarctica is more and more in the mainstream of science these days. Here's the fish, and this work has been going on antifreeze and fishes for decades, and yet new findings are coming out almost every year. This past year, here's one of the fishes that have that kind of blood. They found that there's always the good news of this antifreeze. It keeps fishes from freezing, but now they found the bad news, which is it also prevents thawing of the ice in their blood if ice does get in there. And the scientists say the potential threat is like dangers posed by asbestos in the lungs or blood clots in the brain. So the quote is, it tells us something about evolution. Every good evolutionary innovation probably comes with some bad unintended effects. Just reaching back to that international collaboration point I mentioned, and that made the list of the sensational 60s, here is a really exciting graph showing the increase in the amount of research literature coming out of both the Antarctic and the Arctic, which has much the same story, over a period of, 30 years. And it also shows the growth in international authorship of these papers. And there is example after example of scientists from different nations collaborating with each other, including the Soviet Union and the United States sending exchange scientists every year during the time that the Cold War was on. But what's very interesting here is that scientific papers with international authors get more attention than scientific papers just from one country. And not to beat a dead horse, but polar science is twice as collaborative, roughly speaking, as world science generally. This was Antarctica. I'm shifting gears here to a new topic. This Antarctica was without ice 33.6 million years ago, and we know this and a lot of other things about Antarctica's past through the study of fossils. This is a Glossopteris leaf found in the other southern continents, and it establishes or helps to establish how the southern continents were joined, and I'm going to show moving pictures of this in a bit. But what's very interesting from a historical point of view is that Scott's party on its South Polar trek in 1911-1912 found Glossopteris, and that was among the rocks that they put on their sleds when they made the trip back from the South Pole. And this particular specimen is in the Natural History Museum in the UK. But at any rate, Glossopteris helped to establish that around 300 to 250 million years ago, the continents were joined. And this was the first evidence. Here is also evidence found in 1969, and I'll just do a little digression here. David Elliott was the head of the party founded from Ohio State, and he said, when I finally found it, it was a long day. I was numb. I was really numb. And it helps us to appreciate, I mean, you know, just reading a research paper, you sometimes don't think about that somebody out there got pretty cold making these findings. So here's, you of course find fossil bones, and here is Lystrosaurus with his clothes on. But again, the same fossils, the same species of fossils are found in other continents. And this was a herbivore. He ate plants. About the size of a Labrador retriever. Friendly little fellow. So I'm just going to do a little bit about Antarctica's geologic past. And we're not going to go through this chart, but I just wanted to remind all of us that the Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago, and we have scant information about what was going on for the longest time. And about 500 million years or so ago, the geologic record becomes much more vivid, and we had the Cambrian explosion of life and first vertebrates, dinosaurs, some 230, 50 million years ago. We started coming along about 2 million years ago. So these various names, on my desk at home, I always have this chart because whenever I read about the ages, I can never remember the numbers. So here's what Earth looked like 300 million years ago, before we found these first fossils. And Antarctica existed, but only as a part of a much larger land mass, or proto-Antarctica, they're calling it. And I would just call out this second author here. Ian Dail is at University of Texas, and his area of study in the world is the so-called Scotia Arc, which is the area between the tip of South America and the tip of Antarctica. The Scotia Arc is that region. And he was the one who caused these maps to be drawn up. So it looks like this. Advancing up to 200 million years ago, and here Antarctica is still tilted away from the polar position. It's not centered on the South Pole, and it's still pretty much connected to the other southern continents. And then we have more fossil finds from that period. This one was found just in 1991, Cryolophosaurus, meaning crested lizard. And the bones of this large animal were found with a bone of the small animal in its mouth. So it maybe died choking on its lunch or something, we don't quite know. Again, it was bones that you would find in the field, and the artist, a painter named Lucia Dolares, worked very closely with the scientist, the paleontologist, to make a painting of what this might have looked like, to help us appreciate what was going on way back then. So now we're going to go a little bit farther, and finally we're starting to see the beginning of the opening of what would become the Southern Ocean about 140 million years ago, but it's still not going all the way around the Antarctic, and the Antarctic is still not centered in the South Pole. So now the Antarctic is down, more or less centered on the South Pole at 80 million years ago, and much of the Southern Ocean has opened. Australia has separated, but we still have a land connection between South America and the Antarctic Peninsula, which is where the ship will go. At about 40 million years ago, the Earth started to cool off. We went from a greenhouse planet to an ice house planet. And we were beginning to see the opening here at the Drake Passage. And at about 33.6 million years ago, Antarctica began to get ice. The other day when we were in Puerto Chacabuco, Chris Wilson and Dave Bresnahan and I went for a walk, and we were actually putting our hands on southern beach, or Nothofagus. Fossils of this same species were found in the Antarctic some years back. And also from South America. So here we have Antarctica today with all the plates and the mid-ocean ridges and so forth, and a now uninterrupted Antarctic circumpolar current, which is the world's largest current. Here's how you find a fossil. But it takes eyes and it takes training, and you or I can, if you're not a paleontologist, can go stumbling around and pick up rock after rock and split one after the other open and never find anything. But the people who have trained themselves over the years can do it much more handily. Another way to get fossils, and these are microfossils, is to drill sediments at the bottom of the ocean. This was a project called the Cape Roberts Project in the Antarctic that drilled down using sea ice as a drilling platform rather than a ship. And this was a tense moment in the Crary Laboratory at McMurdo Station when these scientists were ever so politely deciding who gets to study which segment of this very, very precious piece of mud. And you get things from it that look like this. Here was a confirmation, a further confirmation that 33.6 million years ago is about when the Antarctic started to get glaciated. And here, this is a nice little story too. I'm going to break a bit from science. In the 1928 and 30 and 33 expeditions by Richard E. Byrd, the chief scientist was named Larry Gould. And today the United States Antarctic program has a ship called the Lawrence M. Gould, named after him. And he had written a book called Cold. And the last line of his book was, "I had rather go back to Antarctica and find a fossil marsupial than 3 gold mines." And it became sort of his rallying cry for continuing to support science in the Antarctic. So in 1982, US and Argentine paleontologists discovered a fossil marsupial in 40-million-year-old rocks on Seymour Island, which is here. And that's just on, we will not get quite over there. The ship will be coming down in this area, maybe up as far as here. And then just in a couple of years ago, Argentine and Swedish paleontologists found another fossil that's even older. So now we have the oldest Antarctic mammal that was ever found in the Antarctic. This is just a couple of years ago. Okay, so I'm going to digress a bit more. How does all this science get done? And Dave already mentioned in his talk about the Antarctic Treaty this morning that there are 50 nations that are collaborative or have signed the Antarctic Treaty, and of them 29 are active in the Antarctic, these 29, and they collectively have stations that are occupied year-round, most of them, some of them summer, all around the Antarctic. But that's not enough, and you need to have, in addition to that, a whole array of unattended or automatic stations doing weather and geophysics that send their data up to satellites and to home institutions. So we have a better array yet of ways to collect Antarctic information. But even that is not enough, and we've talked about ice cores, and ice cores were drilled at the places that you see the blue dots, and sedimentary cores, like the one I showed you, were drilled at the places with the red dots, and there's more planned. So this is the hard work that goes into collecting information about the Antarctic. And of course, then we've now had, in the last, since 1979, an array of satellites that have collected information over the whole of the Antarctic. Their information would be very little use, except for the fact that we have ground truth from all those scientists in the Antarctic and all those instruments in the Antarctic. Ground truth required. And balloons are launched, and airplanes with special antennas are doing various soundings. There are automated vehicles like this one that can be directed by computer programs to go where you want them to go underwater, even under ice shelves, and that's been done. And here's an even cheaper underwater vehicle. And I found this, again, is recent information, and this report that was in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showed these tracks where elephant seals are going enormous distances. And I thought, they just can't be doing that. And I've looked up the original scientific paper that actually said, yes, they're making sometimes 200-day sorties. And they carry this instrumented data pack, sensing pack, and every time they surface, it can transmit to satellites, and again, either to a ship or to the home institution. So I've just covered a few things where Antarctica is sending us information about planet Earth. There's another entire area to think about, and that's where you're using Antarctica not to study Antarctica, but as a research platform. And this is some of the array of instruments at the South Pole that are looking up. And a good bit of this is to look into the origins of the universe. And here, I'm just reaching back in time here. In 2002, one of the breakthroughs of the year, according to Science magazine, was finding cosmic microwave background information. This is from the very beginnings of the universe, almost, with an instrument at the South Pole. And this was the beginning of a new chapter in cosmic microwave background research, they argued. And it would show us what the universe was like a fraction of a second old. So jump forward to March of 2014, there was a press conference, and it was dramatic, and it got coverage in all the newspapers and the magazines. This notion of inflation, universe inflation, a stupendously rapid expansion that the universe is thought to have undergone within the first 10 to the minus 36 seconds. That's 10, a decimal with 36 zeros, and then a 1. After the Big Bang, in other words, a really short time. And during the expansion, quantum fluctuations in the gravitational field grew in size, eventually turning into long wavelength gravitational waves that stretched space in one transverse direction and compressed it in the perpendicular one. So that's the theory. And the establishment of some instruments at the South Pole was thought to have confirmed that theory. And Antarctica telescope, according to the headline, may have provided first direct evidence of cosmic inflation and origins of the universe. And then in September, another group said the results are not encouraging for attributing this particular finding to cosmic inflation. And then just in, this was actually the 31st of January 2015 in the New York Times. This is a gorgeous drawing of what the cosmos looked like in those first few microseconds. And what the two teams, the team that had done this original research and the criticizing team, got together for a few months, and they said, well, missed on that one. A patch of sky that was thought to show the most ancient light in the universe is just dust. But that's the reason I showed this. This would have been a finding of the year. It would have won Nobel Prizes had it really been confirmed. Instead, it helps us to appreciate science does not always get it right the first time, but science itself is a self-correcting mechanism where the quest for the correct information is inevitable, and it never sways from that. And if one scientist says something, there are 10 scientists out there saying, wait a minute. So that's how science works. I've already mentioned the ozone hole. Just very briefly, I'll cover it here. Here was the largest one back in September of 2006. And we've had a great success story. Many of you are familiar with this, where the Montreal Protocol was agreed upon, where the harmful man-made chemical constituents in the stratosphere that were causing the Antarctic ozone hole are being phased out. And so we're now seeing, after this precipitous decline in ozone in the stratosphere, a gradual pull out of that hole. And by doing this, we're going to save lives because of ultraviolet radiation being prevented from reaching the surface, just like it was before the ozone hole got started in the 1970s. We're going to avoid skin cancer and have fewer cataracts, and the crop harvest will not decline as much as it would have otherwise. We've now confirmed through observations of various sorts that the Antarctic is warming, just like the other continents are warming. And as you might have guessed, West Antarctica, where all that ice shelf loss is taking place, is warming quicker than the rest of the continent of Antarctica. And the Antarctic Peninsula is warming faster, yet it is warming as fast as any place in the southern hemisphere and equal to the Arctic, parts of the Arctic. And so this is just, what's happening basically is these lines of equal temperature are being shoved southward. And it's a remarkably short period of time, only about 50 years. So what this is causing is various changes in both the ocean. Here's the loss of krill population that some people attribute to a warmer ocean, and as a result of the loss of krill, penguin lavage. And the scientist says, doesn't hurt the penguin a bit. And I've never had one done. But this is the usual destination of the krill. And so people at Palmer Station, and they'll probably show you this graph if they come aboard in a few days, are seeing a decline in some penguin species that depend on sea ice, and a rapid rise in populations that don't need the sea ice in order to go fishing. In my ice lecture, I mentioned that Antarctic ice is the cleanest on Earth, and it is, and the atmosphere over Antarctica is the cleanest on Earth, and it is. So I was really interested to see this finding, again, just last year, where lead from a particular mine in Australia has been detected in ice cores around the continent in the locations that I'm showing you here. And it was surprising to me, because I thought I had the understanding that by the time the atmosphere mixes up, well, in the Antarctic, the atmosphere is mixed up so thoroughly that you wouldn't be able to identify particular source points, but in fact that is the case. New species are still being reported from the Antarctic, and here is one that does not win a beauty contest, I think, but it was hauled up when people were fishing off in the Ross Sea. To catch Antarctic toothfish, sort of like this, you must bait your hook with Peruvian squid, cast it in the depths of the Ross Sea. This is what a team of Ukrainians did on a fishing trip near Antarctica, but sometimes you catch a hop-beard plunder fish, which is what they pulled up 3 of these, actually. And here is another view, equally beautiful. The Southern Ocean, with relatively simplified species assemblages and ecosystems near the physiological tolerance limits for life, provides an unparalleled opportunity to probe the laws of community assembly, species interactions, and ecosystem responses to climate variability. Moving on, here is an ice core was drilled to the bottom in West Antarctica, and then another one more recently with hot water actually brought up samples from the bottom. And this is what they found: bacterial colonies that were viable, that grew when they put them in a petri dish, 800 meters underneath the ice sheet. I put this one in because the ship very likely could go right over Hook Ridge. Here are the South Shetland Islands here. We'll be near them and in this body of water very likely. And at Hook Ridge is a hydrothermal vent. Looks like this if you were to go down and take a picture. So if you feel a little bump, you'll know what it was. This is not a discovery, really, but I did want to just touch on mineral resources of the Antarctic because so many people are interested. And U.S. Geological publication some years back says there are no known mineral deposits in the Antarctic, period. And that, as far as anybody can tell, is still the case. But there are still plenty of mineral occurrences all around the Antarctic. After all, it's a whole continent. What would you expect? You would expect to find them. So all of these shows, if you will, of these various substances are found, but to try to mine them, it just wouldn't make any sense so far anyway, and my guess is that's the way it's going to be for a good long time. I'm getting to the end, and here is another recent finding in the January 2000 issue of Physics Today. It used to be thought that the upwelling of cold ocean water from the bottom was taking place all over the world, even though most cold water is formed around the Antarctic. And it is now thought, pretty much guaranteed to be coming up mostly around the Antarctic, which is one reason the Antarctic has such a prominent amount of biological productivity, up to and including whales. So this picture, this is the last slide, this picture shows a blue whale pretty much at the surface, a little bit under the surface, another blue whale that's pretty much at the surface, and here is blue whale poop. And, well, my takeaway message was, don't swim behind blue whales, but the point was that most people had assumed that if blue whales become plentiful again, it's going to hurt the fishery. And this study, it was a modeling study, a lab study, has concluded that in fact the reverse is true. The defecations of blue whales contribute, in particular iron, but other nutrients too, and actually stimulate the fishery. So I'm going to end this presentation by saying, here's yet another reason to save the whales. Thanks for listening.